Sac. I'm actually, don't throw anything at me, but I'm a Dodger fan. When the Dodgers got out, you know who we got to go for. We got to go for California teams. So I'm a Giants fan when it comes to. I was a Giants fan tonight, that's for sure. Yeah. But almost right ninth inning, I was a little scared there. Thought we were going to bring it back here. That would have been nice. So I love bikes, man. I've been riding bikes since I was 16 years old. I came home with a bike and a Ninja. My dad walked me back there and tried to get me to return it. They wouldn't take it back. Like, you are not riding a motorcycle. So this sat in the garage for about 4 years until I turned 18. And been riding bikes ever since. I grew up in San Bernardino, California. And 15 years ago, I started a company called Tap Out with my best friend. At that time, I didn't really have any mentors growing up. I didn't have anybody to look up to. I grew up really poor in an area of San Bernardino where, I mean, in my block, 18th Street, they literally blocked off both sides of the street and wouldn't let anybody drive down that street because there were so many drive-bys. And I'd always had bad cars growing up. I was embarrassed of where I lived. I wouldn't let any of my friends come over. And I always wanted something more for my life and something more for my family. And at that time, the only thing ever to come out of San Bernardino was the McDonald's back in the 1950s and the Hells Angels. It was only successful businesses coming out of San Bernardino. So I didn't have anybody that I could say, that you could grow up here and still make it. So I started reading books and started looking at people in business and trying to model myself after them. In high school, I became obsessed with being a police officer, and right out of high school, I put myself through the academy. I saved every penny I had and put myself through the police academy, and I became a cop. And I was a cop for 7 years until I lost my job. I got fired. That's a whole nother story in itself. We don't have enough time for that one.
Sad.
But I had to regather myself because I felt like my dream had been taken away. And I'm sure a lot of people have felt that before. You felt like you wanted to do something, you knew that's all you ever wanted to do, and then all of a sudden that's ripped away from you. So I refocused and started to try to figure out what I was going to do with my life. And I remember, actually, when I was getting fired, this is a short story, when I was getting fired, I was sitting in the locker room, and my chief, I walked in the chief's office, and he said, "We're not going to need your services anymore." And I looked at him, and I said, "Do you know I have a loaded gun on my side? Like, who fires somebody with a loaded gun on their side?" Like, what was he? I literally laid the gun on his table, and I said, "Here, take your gun." And his badge, and I picked up that badge. And I walked back to the locker room, and I sat down and I cried because I thought my life was over. That's all I ever wanted to do. And then I remember that a few weeks earlier, I was driving down the street, and I saw this white Lamborghini driving down the street, and I pulled it over. Like, what are you going to do? Lamborghinis didn't drive down my city. They didn't drive down there. So when you see a white Lamborghini, what do you do but pull it over, right? So I pulled it over, and I asked him, I just got to ask you a question. I pulled you over because you have no front license plate. We're not going to let that go. Because he was trying to get me to sit in his car. He said I could drive his car, and I can't drive your car. But I do want to ask you a question. Can you tell me, how were you able to buy a car like this? You know what he told me? He inherited it. And I thought, I'm never going to have anybody in my family leave me a Lamborghini. I don't know about anybody in here. Anybody getting a Lamborghini left to them? That's never going to happen to me. Never. So I thought, I got to change something in my life. And it started me thinking. And then when I was getting fired, and when I'm sitting in that locker room, I thought, maybe this is what I'm meant to do. Maybe something else. I'm meant to do something else. And I just felt like everything was going to be okay. And I got up and I walked out of there. And me and my friends started talking. I was taking Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at the time. We saw the first UFC in 1993. And a week later, I was training with Hoist Gracie in Torrance. Because we were using that for our law enforcement. We were teaching defensive tactics. And then we thought, we saw the Gracies selling all these shirts. They would sell all these shirts, these Gracie Jiu-Jitsu shirts, and all, boy behind you was walking up and tapping you on the shoulder like, man, where'd you get that shirt from? Because everybody wanted to know. And I was like, yeah, I train with those dudes. I thought I was tough enough. I wasn't really that tough at the time. But I felt it gave me this certain feeling. I thought, what if we could develop a shirt where people could wear that shirt and they have that same feeling, but you could wear it no matter where you train. So if you trained at the Shark Tank, or if you trained at the Lion's Den, or if you trained with the Gracies, you could wear the same shirt. Anybody could wear that shirt. If you were a fan of the sport, you could wear that shirt. And it'd give you that same feeling. So we started printing some shirts, and literally, this table is the exact size of the first table that we bought to sell our shirts on. And we would go to these small jiu-jitsu tournaments and set up our shirts up on the table, and we'd sell them. And we just kept selling our shirts, and we'd buy 12 shirts to sell them, and buy 24 shirts to sell them, to buy 48 shirts, and that's how we kept growing our business. And then one day, this show called Ultimate Fighter, have you guys heard of it? It's on television. This show called Ultimate Fighter comes on, and they decide they're going to start filming this show. And Chuck Liddell calls me. Chuck Liddell's from up here too. You guys big Chuck Liddell fans? Chuck Liddell calls me and says, hey, I'm about to be on this show. If you guys want me to wear some shirts, come up to Vegas. Bring me some shirts, I'll wear them on the show for free. Because he was my fighter and I was sponsoring him as a fighter in the UFC. And I was driving down to San Diego. I was taking my daughter to SeaWorld. And I was an hour down the road on my way to San Diego. And I turned to my daughter and I asked her, hey baby, Daddy's friend just called him, and he's got to go to work. Is it okay if I turn around? I need to go to work, and we're not going to be able to go to SeaWorld today. And she said, okay. And I always remember that because I always remind her of that story because I felt like that was her time that she gave back to me and helped this dream come true. And I always remind her of that she helped Daddy's dream come true. So we drove up to Vegas, and I brought all these shirts, and Chuck Liddell, had a lot of shirts that he had to wear on the show, and we were staying in his place with him, so as he came home from the show, those shirts would get dirty. Well, we would hide all the non-tap-out shirts underneath his bed, and we'd only wash the tap-out shirts for him. So every time he got on the show, that's all he had to wear was these tap-out shirts. And then the show comes on, and the finale comes on, and when the finale comes on, I was in the event center at University of Las Vegas when the show started, and you could feel the electricity in the room. It's so crazy. The electricity, everybody just knew something special was about to happen, and these fights started. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen the Stephan Bonner-Forrest Griffin fight, but it's literally one of the most amazing fights you'll ever see in your life. It went down in history. It's probably one of the best top 5 fights ever in UFC history. And the crowd was on their feet yelling, and at one point Dana White walks back to Chuck Liddell, who was sitting next to me, and says, there's 10 million people watching this show right now. And we've never had that type of viewing audience before in UFC history. UFC purchases are typically about 150 buys, and a few people in each house. Just nowhere close to that. And all of a sudden we have 10 million people watching this show. Overnight, my life changed. My web guy called me that night and said, what the is going on? Your website has 3,000 orders an hour coming through right now. I went from barely being able to pay my bills to getting paid $100,000 a month. I couldn't believe it. My life changed overnight. My dad called me a few weeks after, maybe a couple months after that, and said that my mom had just got mugged out in front of our house for her purse, literally on the doorstep. Got beat up, knocked on the ground, and her purse ripped out of her hands. And I told my dad, I said, you got to get you guys out of there. And I finally had the means to do that. And it was a few months before Christmas, and I drove my parents up to where we thought we were going to go to a Christmas party and meet with the friends of theirs. And I drove them to this house up on top of this hill, and they walked up to the front door, and I handed them these keys to their brand new house. up on top of the hill, fully furnished. And they walked in that house and they were crying. I walked them over to the garage, and they'd never owned a new car in their life. And they opened the door, and there was a brand new white Lexus in there with a big red bow on it. And that's like the best feeling in the world that you can do that for your parents. And that's why I do what I do. I do that for my kids and my parents, my family. And I love what I do. And I love that I'm here tonight. I love that this is all happening because I get to be here because of all that. That's so cool. I love hanging out with moto guys. You know, that's why we all wave to each other on the road, right? Because we're the coolest mofos around, right? That's why we all wave to each other, because it's that inner thing. We had that same thing with tap out. In the early days when you had a tap out shirt, you walk by another guy with a tap out hat on, you kind of like nod, you know, like everybody like, hey, you know, we know each other. And that's what all us moto guys know, right? We all know each other. When we drive by each other and we give ourselves away, it's because we all know each other. We're all putting it out there. We know what it feels like to ride a bike, and a lot of people don't know what that feels like. Well, thank you guys for having me. I hope you guys have a great night. I brought some cool stuff for you. Just give her Melinda's glove. I hope somebody cool gets that. Enjoy it. Okay, thank you guys. Have a great night.